Hello and welcome to a brand new series of videos I'm calling Archery Sights ad Nauseum, and I'm going to go over the Dialed Arxos Bowsight, specifically the dovetail version. I was at TAC 7 Springs in June milling about before my knock time, and I went to the Dialed Archery booth to take a look. I had been following their social media for a while they were developing the site, and was kind of interested, was mildly interested to see what it was going to look like in person. Wasn't crazy about the price though, and I can't say I was terribly impressed when I handled one of their display models. The dial itself was stiff, and it wasn't very smooth once I actually got it moving. Since those two things will make dialing in a precise yardage on a single pin sight difficult, I was fairly satisfied that I wasn't interested, but here I am with one in my hands, so we'll get to that. Regardless of how I felt about it, there is some buzz going around about the sight and people are talking about it, but the opinions of the Dialed Arxos sight seem to lie on polar opposites of each other. One is that it's amazing, it's the best thing ever, and does what it advertises, and the other is that it's overpriced, not worth the cost, and the design needs to be scrapped and started over. The truth is usually somewhere in the middle, and I'm going to try and help break down where it might fall on that spectrum. So because of all the arguing about the site, mostly on Archery Talk, I got interested in it because for whatever reason I just gravitate towards things that are odd or different, or I get an idea in my head and it gives me an itch that I need to scratch. So I went to the Archery Talk Classifieds and I bought a used one and let somebody else eat the cost of buying a new one. I have trouble justifying paying the price, or at least the MSRP, for most archery equipment nowadays on account of how fast its value depreciates. It ages like bread instead of wine, as an old comic used to say, rest his soul. The only reason I bought so many of the releases on the wall behind me brand new is because I needed to get them fast, and I didn't want to wait for them to start showing up in the classifieds. These do eventually pay for themselves, though, or at least the ones that I do a lot of holsters for eventually pay for the ones that I don't do a whole lot of holsters for. So anyway, full disclosure, I spent my own money on this site, and I have no motivation or incentive to judge it one way or the other. So let's talk about features, implementation, and what niche this site is meant to occupy. I would characterize the Arxos as a hunting target hybrid with a heavy focus on being streamlined. I think it accomplishes that well, with a few exceptions. I do like how it's designed to have nothing sticking out, so it's probably good for moving around in brush. There's no extra levers. It doesn't look like there's anything there that doesn't need to be there, and like I said, there are a few little exceptions and issues with that are going to come up, and I'll discuss that shortly. This is certainly not exclusive to Dialed Archery, but it is something that happens a lot with marketing with archery products. The company decided to come up with their own names for some of the components for the purposes of either their own indulgence or to make them sound edgy. I find the concept to be cringy, so I'll be going off on a tangent or two regarding names as well as taglines. The tendency to do this is not specific to Dialed Archery, but July's been a terrible month, so they're going to get it first. One of the taglines on their website and some of their social media posts is "designed on purpose." Well, yes, we know. I can't imagine what you were working on that you could have stumbled into making an archery site by accident. So of course it was designed on purpose. I suppose the meaning is supposed to imply form-fitting function, but designed on purpose has about as much gravitas as saying, "we made this." Marketing slogans and taglines can sound profound until you start to pick them apart and realize most of them are actually pretty meaningless. A lot of companies go out of their way naming their products or services in a way that makes them sound cool or edgy. You don't need to do that. It's kind of overplayed at this point. If your product is good, and you market it in a way that showcases its merits, people will buy it. Then again, what do I know? I'm just a holster maker. I will be coming back to this throughout the video. I could rant about it endlessly, but I'm going to leave it there for now. Anyway, moving on. The Arxos is a slider sight with a dial that can be shot as a multi-pin sight and would be just as much at home on a hunting bow or a 3D rig. I don't think it would be ideal on something like an indoor target bow for shooting spots because despite having a similar price tag, it doesn't have the ultra-fine elevation adjustment of a target sight like the Axel Achieve, CBE Elevate, Montana Black Gold Competition, and others where you have a fast travel adjustment and then a micro dial to fine-tune your yardage by almost imperceptible movements. So you can't move this thing, you're not going to be able to move it like a half inch or something if you're trying to break a line or something and it's just not working. So it doesn't have it's got that for windage adjustment, but elevation is gang more than it is micro. The target hunting hybrid sights usually have a dial or a knob for gang elevation adjustment, and dialing in precise yardages is up to your grip strength and fine motor skills to contend with the stiffness of the dial. So the Arxos occupies the same space in the market as the Spot Hog, Fast Eddies, or Tommy Hogs, and the HHAs are other sights where you put your sight tape directly on the adjustment wheel. Some of them have adjustable tension as well as a mechanism to lock the wheel at its current setting, but the Arxos is not one of them. So what is it about the Arxos that would distinguish it from the rest of the sights that occupy this niche, and is it worth the $499 to $540 price tag depending on options and not factoring the cost of additional accessories? Well, it has an air of durability to it, although some people don't think so. It looks like you could bang it around without it losing its zero. It looks beefy as compared to other sights like the Axel Achieve, which actually looks kind of dainty, even though it's pretty tough in and of itself. I'd be interested to see some torture testing on the Arxos, but I won't be doing it with equipment I paid for myself. It also has a very distinct look to it. I'm going to be putting this on my PSE, my new to me, because I bought that used as well, PSE Mach 1, and I actually think aesthetically it looks pretty slick. Sorry if you hear some chirping or different noises in the background, my birds just woke up. The Arxos' signature feature, other than the big hole in the center of the adjustment wheel and offering lots of opportunities for customization, which I'll talk about in a moment, is the angled elevation system. The elevation bar is angled rearward by 20 degrees, so as you increase your yardage, the bar moves the scope down and back instead of just down. The idea is, by moving the scope down and towards the riser, that you can set up your bow with a shorter sight tape and gain additional yardage before you start having issues with clearance between your arrow vanes and the bottom of your scope. The trigonometry of it is that moving your scope closer to your eye reduces the distance the scope needs to be raised vertically, well actually it moves down, in order to aim at longer ranged targets. So when the scope is closer to your eye, it doesn't have to be moved down as far in order to get the same alignment for a long distance shot. If that makes sense, please let me know in the comments, because I could break down some visuals in part 2 that would make it easier to visualize. It's really if you take just two lines, if you hit a point, if you draw a point on a piece of paper and then you draw two rays coming out of it, the closer you are to the apex, the closer together the two things are. So you don't have to raise so if in this case, if you're closer to the axis, you don't have to move it up as far, as opposed to being out here where you'd have to move it up a lot further in order to achieve the same sight picture. So based on a quick measurement, the elevation bar moves the scope approximately 1 inch to the rear from the top of its travel to the bottom. So you're probably wondering, how much of a difference does that 1 inch of movement actually make? Well, it's actually less than an inch, because the majority of compound archers are more likely to either get to the end of their sight tape or run out of arrow clearance before they bottom out the elevation bar. I'm currently not convinced that there will be a significant benefit now that I know that's how little it moves. The other issue with this is the arrangement that has to do with aligning your peep sight with the scope housing, so when you're at full draw everything is lined up with each other, but again, I don't think that's going to make a huge difference. If you have screw-in apertures, maybe check it out and see if it does. I use just a regular 3/16 inch peep, and I don't really line everything up. So your mileage may vary, and like I said, if you have a scope or rather a peep sight like the Hamskea or the specialty archery that has screw-in apertures, give it a try. Maybe the smaller one might help, but then again, you might have to try and split the difference if it does actually make that much of a difference, but like I said, I don't think it's going to. I will say I doubt that there will be zero difference, because there has to be at least some measurable change, otherwise they couldn't, or rather shouldn't, advertise that it performs this function. The question is, does a fraction of an inch of shift produce a significant enough difference in point of impact to make this feature appealing to a prospective customer, or is it insignificant and more of a marketing gimmick? Is it enough of a difference to want to seek this sight out because it does that? That being said, an inch can make a big difference depending on the context, right fellas? So I'm not outright dismissing it, but it does make me want to test it. There are people online who insist that there is a noticeable difference in the size of their sight tape, some achieving up to an additional 5 to 10 yards of vein clearance before the bottom of the scope starts to come in contact with their veins. I'm going to do a part 2 to follow up and test how much of a difference there will be in the length of my sight tape between the Arxos and a sight that only moves the scope up and down vertically. Specifically, I'm going to use the Redline Torch dovetail sight, which will be getting its own review after I finish this one. I'm going to sight them both in on the same bow, and then measure the difference in vertical movement between the arrow shaft and the center of the pin, just in case the diameter of the scope housing is different. I'm also going to take the other sight and move it back an inch and check to see if the same effect can be achieved with any dovetail sight, which I suspect that it probably can. So what comes in the box? The Arxos comes in a cardboard box, and in that box you get the sight, a dovetail mounting block with the dovetail sight, one extra sight tape ring, a piece of paper that shows you how to set up your indicator pins, and 48 different stick-on sight tapes. It does not come with the tools necessary to make adjustments or to change out the adjustment wheel. To get that, you have to buy it right off the website or purchase another adjustment wheel or the scope kit. In terms of customization, the Arxos is available in a dovetail mount or a Picatinny rail mount. The dovetail is sized to fit the Matthews bridge lock, which is inconsequential to the other 95% of the compound bow market, but it's worth mentioning. Both mounts are integrated into the Arxos's body, so you will not be able to change it out if you change bows like you would an Axel sight where the mounts are interchangeable. Something odd on the dovetail mounting block, though, is the lockdown bolt to secure the sight is just a grub screw and doesn't have the knob in order to turn and remove the sight from your bow. So if you're going to take it off, you're going to have to use an Allen key, which is not included. So either they don't want you taking the sight off once it's installed, or they did it to further streamline the aesthetic. This is fine if you leave your sight on your bow, but the scope doesn't have a quick release either. And some people like to put their sights in their own case so they don't get bumped around and lose their zero. I leave mine on the bow if I can get it to fit in the case, so that's not going to be an issue for me. But like I said, it's not a quick release if you have to use tools. So they don't call it a quick release though. So I don't know why they decided to do it that way. Colors. The body of the Arxos can be ordered in black, earth, which is essentially flat dark earth, sage, which is OD greenish, and smoke, which looks like a slate gray. I think the smoke one is supposed to match the Matthews gray, like the gray, slate gray color. So aside from black, the color choices are firmly aimed at hunters and 3D archers. There are some small batch options like Battle Worn, which is black with some silvery spots to look like the finish is worn and seen a lot more action than it actually has. To me, in my opinion, that's full Mall Ninja, and in my opinion, you never go full Mall Ninja. They also have Whiskey, which is meant to match a finish from Hoyt called Bourbon, and it looks a lot like Coyote Brown. I think they also have one that has some kind of, I forget what it's called. It has some of like the map elevation, topographical. I think it has like a topographical pattern to it. Once again, small batch. But so a couple of options. Like I said, the only real target color is black that they offer. They don't have anything else fancy. Everything else is earth tones. The elevation or yardage dial also comes in a variety of colors. So it is referred to as the void dial. Get it? Because it runs through a hole in the middle of the sight. And the sight tape ring, which they call switch tapes, clamps onto the end of it that protrudes out the other side. It comes in black, earth, sage, smoke, gray, red, orange, green, yellow, white, blue, purple, and pink. You can also purchase them separately and change up the color scheme. The void dial comes with a wrench that you will be using to adjust it. It's basically a piece of what looks like 14 gauge steel. It's coated black with the Dialed logo laser engraved onto both sides of it. There is a hole for a key ring, and the large rectangular slot in it that has no application in archery looks to be meant as a bottle opener. This kind of reminds me of the cheap choke wrenches for extended chokes on like a Turkish-made shotgun. It's usually just a piece of steel, and it fits right into the notches. That fits into the notches for adjustment, and that's how it works. A word on fit and finish of the void dial. I'm going to stop doing that. They are also Cerakoted, similarly to the body of the sight, as evidenced by the spots on the inside area of this gray dial. The exposed bare aluminum is not going to be visible when the sight is assembled. However, while it is understandable to avoid spraying the threads to keep them from sticking, dialed, you really should consider coating every bit of this bare aluminum as you can. It isn't visible when the sight is assembled, but when you pull it out of a box after you purchase it separately, it looks cheap, unfinished, and unbefitting of a $500 sight. I gave the same criticism to UltraView of their finger attachments for the UV button. The holes where the mounting screws go into are not fully coated, and you can see bare metal in there. Once again, an area that is not visible when the release is assembled, but it is visible when the customer buys the parts and pulls them out of the packaging. In the case of the void dial, the coating in this area will probably not affect its function, and if wear is a concern, you might want to consider anodizing your parts instead of Cerakoting them. Moving along, you can also select whether you want your sight tape ring to sit on the right side or left side of the sight. I would recommend you choose to have your sight tape on the scope side for reasons I will explain shortly. Dialed Archery refers to their scopes as mags, because making up your own edgy sounding terms is more fun than just using the terms we all understand. I'm going to refer to them as scopes for the rest of this video so everyone who is watching or listening knows what I'm referring to. Coming up with your own names for things that already have names is silly. I did something similar when I first started selling release holsters. I tried to call my products release carriers because I didn't want to call them holsters because I thought it sounded corny. But after a few months of everyone else calling them holsters, I just gave up and accepted it. Anyway, the scopes can be had in a single pin. The selection is 1XR, and I can only assume it's short for 1 pin extra range because it doesn't actually explain it on the website, or a stacked 3-pin configuration, which the selection is 3V. The pins are stacked on one vertical stalk and mounted to the bottom of the sight housing. The scope does not have additional spots around the housing to change the angle of the stalk, a la Shrewd or Axel. If you select the 3-pin, that makes sense, but if you go with the single pin, you can't change the angle if you prefer something different. The single pin also has an extra fiber optic at the base of the stalk, and you would use that to extend your range when you start to run out of clearance with the fletching of your arrows. The second and third pins are not independently adjustable, but they include in the package the little paper scale that shows where you should set the yardage indicators for them. At that point, you'd sight in the top pin, and the secondary pins are just wherever they fall on your sight tape. I'm still learning what the application is of having fixed non-adjustable pins on a moving sight. I know you can use them to shoot longer distances and not worry about arrow clearance, but then I would think having a second pin way down on the stock like they did with the single pin would be optimal. I just don't see 3 stacked non-adjustable pins as optimal, because you'd have to be pretty lucky to get them to line up in increments of 5 or remember what they actually are when you might be in a stress situation. So if anybody knows what the better application is for that, just let me know in the comments. Moving along. The scope, when you order the whole package together, the scopes are color matched to the frame without the option to change it. You can also order just the frame and install an aftermarket scope, provided it works with the adapter. If you order the frame by itself, you will get the adapter and the tool to make some adjustments. You could order the frame separately and then the scope separately if you wanted 2 different colors, but then you're paying extra for something that costs less when purchased as a package. For pin size on the scope, you get a choice of 10 thousandths or 19 thousandths, and there is no option for different size pins on the 3-pin. So it's all or nothing. So a 19 at the top and 10s at the bottom, for the bottom 2, is not yet available as an option. The single pin has a secondary pin on the bottom of the stock to be used for longer distances when you may run out of arrow clearance. I think I said that above. There is a little card included for setting the indicator for that as well. They figured out what the gaps are for the indicator pins for both configurations to keep us from having to figure it out ourselves. So thank you. That's actually one headache I don't really need to suffer or don't need to worry about. The bubble level is on the smaller side. Giant bubble levels seem to be popular as of lately, and it is mounted to the top of the scope instead of the bottom, probably to get it out of the way of that long-range pin. That's fine, you just have to adjust to glancing up instead of down. Also on the top of the scope is a sliding rheostat to adjust the brightness of the pins, and all the fiber is also located up there. It's not wrapped around the scope. The length of the fiber optic cable collecting light for the pins is not very long, but in the lighting I've used them in so far, I haven't had any issues seeing them. I've shot indoors, in my basement, out in daylight, and at night under the bright lights of the local outdoor range. We have one that has stadium lighting, and there's enough, I could see enough of the pins to be able to use it under those conditions. The Dialed Archery scope will accept a lens kit from Dialed, and it consists of a lens, something that looks like a gasket for the lens, and a castle nut that threads into the front of the scope to secure the lens in place. The engineers at Dialed must be fans of firearms and AR-15 components, because it reminds me very much of a shotgun's choke tube. And the nut that locks the void dial to the body also looks a lot like a castle nut for an AR-15 buffer tube. Coincidence? Probably not. The scope kit costs $150, by the way, and that puts this whole package up to more than half of my monthly mortgage payment. Thankfully, I don't use a scope. If you don't want to use a Dialed scope and just want to order the frame, there will be a bracket included in the package that allows you to mount a Shrewd or UltraView scope to the Arxos. As for other brands, any scope that attaches by way of a bolt that threads from the inside of the scope housing, think Viper, CBE, B3, they should fit the bill. I'm not sure about others. Scopes that attach by way of a threaded rod are a no-go without having to learn how to use washers to clock your scope like a muzzle brake. So things like the Axel AVs or AXs or AVXs are going to be a no-go. There are a few spots on the Arxos where the application of the Cerakote on the body feels rougher than others. One in particular is the inside of the dovetail that sits against the riser and where the logo is stamped or lasered on. For some reason that feels rougher than the rest. It might just be that that wasn't polished or machined. From the looks of it, it almost looks like it was cast and they just didn't polish it, but I don't think that was the deal. It's pretty much this entire piece, because this whole thing here is one piece that goes around here. So, and then pretty much the whole thing is rougher than the other piece that attaches to it. So either whoever applied this did it more haphazardly, or this just wasn't tumbled as long. So anyway, There seems to be a push towards using Cerakote on more archery accessories instead of anodizing them. It might be because of the variety of colors available, or because it may be easier to apply. However, I still think anodizing is superior in consistency and durability. Cerakote is tough if it is applied properly, and that's a big if. The dovetail on the Arxos is aluminum, and instead of detents, there are vertical lines machined onto the dovetail to index the mounting block. The ball on the end of the locking bolt is larger than the lines machined onto the bar, so you will be leaving marks on the bar depending on how tight you cinch it down. Since the dovetail mounting block doesn't have a quick release knob and uses a grub screw instead to lock it down, it is probably best to leave the sight on the bow so you don't see these marks staring back at you from your $500 sight. This one already has one right there. The yardage indicators consist of a set of 4 little metal pins with feet mounted on the inside of the dial to index your sight tape. To adjust them, there is a plate with 2 locking screws that you loosen to allow them to move, then you slide them up and down to arrange them to correspond to your chosen yardages, or to set them based on that little indicator scale to set the pin gaps. I'm not sure why there are 4 of them, unless they're providing for the use of an aftermarket 4-pin sight. I don't know for sure. In future, I'd like to see them use this mounting point and develop a magnifier, because the pins are good enough, but it would be nice if they were a little bit more precise. And you could even use that, you could even offer 2 different versions to cover and then just etch the pin gap on them already, because you can rotate the switch tape that's on it and line everything up without too much trouble. So food for thought. I'd like to see a magnifier. It would also look just as streamlined that way, maybe even more. Remember earlier how I said you probably want to select your to have your sight ring on the scope side of that? That's because there isn't a mounting point for the indicator pins on the outside of the scope. So if you put your tapes on the outside, you get no indicator pins except for this reference mark on the body of the sight, and for that reason I question why they even bothered making it an option to position the sight tape ring on the outside at all. So for those who did order their Arxos sight with the sight tapes on the outside, I do have good news. There is a way to reverse it. It's not that easy, and I definitely didn't take mine apart and figure it out as soon as I noticed that the indicators didn't exist on both sides of the sight, because mine showed up, the guy who bought it, and everything was arranged on the outside. So doing so does not appear to avoid the warranty, which is lifetime transferable and no questions asked, but I'm not going to show you in this video for the sake of time. If anybody really wants to see it, I might be able to put something together. But like I said, I don't know why they didn't just... I know it's for looks, like they wouldn't be able to put that on the outside and the inside without changing the aesthetic. But like I said, why offer it as an option to begin with? The first axis is set via a track on the scope rod that interfaces with the clamp that clamps the scope rod to the elevation bar. So first axis isn't really adjustable, it's technically set from the factory, and I'm fine with that. The second axis adjustment is on the bracket that attaches the scope to the elevation bar. Something I noticed while I was tinkering with it was if you loosen these 2 bolts, you can set the elevation bar into its uppermost setting and then slide the scope up or down on it in order to get your closest pin yardage. Since you can't move the sight body up or down like most sights because the dovetail is integrated, this allows you to be able to use the entire range of travel of your elevation bar, or at least as much as you're able to use it yourself. You'll have to readjust your second axis after you loosen it, but I thought that was a clever idea or workaround that makes for a very clean design. There are also hash marks on the front of the elevation bar for reference, and hash marks on the scope rod for your gang and fin adjustments. And I love me some reference marks, and I especially love when I remember to photograph them before I make any adjustments. Third axis adjustment is a bolt on the scope rod that hinges the scope so you can center the bubble for shots at angles and long distances. It is not micro adjustable, but very few of them are. There's actually Second axis is generally gang adjust. Third axis, there are some sites that have third axis adjustment. First is not, and there's a couple where everything is micro adjustable. I'll get to those eventually. Gang windage adjustment is accomplished by loosening the clamp on the elevation bar and sliding the scope rod in or out manually. Once again, check your second axis after you do it. Fine adjustment is accomplished via a worm drive that turns inside the scope rod and moves something like 35 clicks per hash mark. So you should be able to dial in your windage as well as your own capabilities allow you. The micro windage adjustment does not have the capability to be locked down, though it doesn't really seem to need it. Everything's pretty... it doesn't make a lot of noise. The clicks themselves are pretty loud and very positive. So at least as far as windage, you should be able to dial it in vertically pretty well. Elevation or yardage adjustment is all done by turning the wheel, referred to by dialed archery as the void dial. It is stiff but relatively smooth, smoother in fact than the display model I handled at TAC. The stiffness may make it harder for very fine elevation adjustments for those who do not have a lot of grip strength. I like to think I have a pretty good amount of grip strength, but it's still a little tricky to move it a half yard while holding it in my hand. Adjusting it while it's attached to a bow will most likely be easier, though. There is no way to change the tension on the wheel and make it harder or easier. The designers set it up so it is stiff enough not to move until you decide to move it. From a standpoint of ergonomics, though, you might find your fingers rubbing against the micro windage adjustment if you have to grab a handful of dial to get it to move for a large change in yardage. That's going to depend on how your bow is sighted in, but it might be an issue, because if you look the way I'm doing it, if I grab it up front, my knuckles are going to be grinding against that. The Arxos has what looks like a crossbolt safety arranged vertically behind the dial. It sticks out at the top and the bottom, and that is used to tighten down the dial and keep it from shifting if it's bumped. It is worth noting that it should be considered as a tensioner as opposed to a lock. I don't know if Dialed says that, but I'm going to say it. You engage it by pressing down and disengage it by pressing back up. It takes some pressure to press it down, but it snaps back when you disengage it. It doesn't completely lock the dial down. There is still a little bit of play with the tensioner engaged, and it equates to about 1 yard's worth of movement on the sight tape, and you can just overpower it entirely by just turning the dial hard. Apparently they made this intentionally so the archer can overpower the tensioner in case you need to make a quick adjustment and couldn't be bothered to unlock it first. However, the dial is already stiff enough to hold its position without locking it down, so it's kind of a redundant feature in its current form. I mean, it still moves, it just makes it doesn't lock it, it just makes it harder to move, as opposed to not making it so you can't move it at all. I feel like other manufacturers did this better by having a locking lever that completely secures the wheel. That way you can actually lighten the tension on the dial and make it easier to turn. It wouldn't look quite as streamlined, but it would make the whole setup a little easier to manipulate. The dial itself has very little slop when changing directions. It doesn't have zero, but it isn't terribly significant, and it takes a good amount of force to move the scope by pressing on the elevation, just pressing on the elevation bar. So I don't think this thing is going to shift with the tensioner disengaged during use, but I'll have to take it out for a few 3D shoots to know for certain if it can be used without touching the tensioner at all. I'm also hoping the sight doesn't loosen up as it wears over time, but if that does happen, then the tensioner is going to become a lot more useful than it currently is. One thing that's worth noting, especially when you look at the price tag, is that, and Dial does deserve a lot of credit for this, is that they are backing up their products with a lifetime, no questions asked, transferable warranty. Most companies will make an effort to get you sorted depending on how much the customer is willing to accept responsibility for being a bell end and screwing things up. So that's a tip for you guys. If you make a mistake, just own it, and usually they'll take care of you. However, there are progressively fewer companies that actually put this in writing. I think it's commendable and shows that they stand by their product and want to keep you as a customer and not just throw you under the bus if you make a mistake, or now that they have your money, they're out in the cold. Alright, so that about covers all the information on this, the information end of this. I hope I didn't miss anything. Either way, I hope my dissertation on the Dialed Arxos was informative and useful. In conclusion, I will finish it off with a question. Is it worth the money? And I think it's a tough question, and it comes down to what your limit is and how much you can justify paying for a single piece of equipment. There are less expensive options that accomplish the same tasks, and I wouldn't have bought this one if I had to pay full price for it. So, if you like how it looks and want to support a small US business that will support its products even if you aren't the original buyer, and you can still manage to keep a roof over your head after placing your order, then go for it. Otherwise, there are plenty of other options to consider. Thank you for watching. If you would like me to continue making videos like this, please let me know in the comments. I will try to get part 2 out as soon as I can, and answer the question of whether that inch of rearward movement will increase your satisfaction, yardage range. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and happy hunting. My products release carriers because I didn't want to call them holsters. Holsters.